with the near-death experiences. We only do near-death experiences from the vantage point of peer-reviewed medical journals. So like in the Lancet, which is the big medical journal in England, or the JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association's Diseases for Children, or whatever it is. So it has to be a peer-reviewed medical journal. It has to be a longitudinal study that lasts for many years. It has to be done over a course of many patients, many hospitals, ranging from 50 to 1,000 patients in a study, et cetera, et cetera. It has to have control groups, et cetera. Clinical death is very well defined, flat EEG, right? No electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, manifested also by fixed and dilated pupils, and no gag reflex, which indicates in the lower brain little sputtering electrical activity. For all intents and purposes, the brain is shut down dead, and take it from me as a guy interested in physics, no electricity, no voltage, no organic and physical activity. Deado deadere. What's my point? My point simply is this. During these manifestations, and we tell the kids this, right? We just go through and say, hey, during these manifestations, a soul literally leaves the body. In 25% of the cases, people undergoing clinical death, 25 experience what's called a near-death experience. So 25%, 75% do not. We don't know why. You know, I can't read God's mind yet. I don't know why. But the fact is 25% do. And it's worth studying those 25% because they're hovering over their bodies and they're able to see a lot of things going on in the operating room and outside the operating room. And the kids are all kind of, no, you're kidding me. No, and I say, here, let's just take a look at some of the veridical evidence. Veridical evidence is something very unusual. So it can't be just something typical that happens during a resuscitation procedure, right? So, a machine or, that's very commonly used, or the paddles which are commonly used during resuscitation. Can't be anything like that. It has to be something truly unusual that the patient saw and can be subsequently verified with great accuracy. So essentially, for example, the guy will say, well, when I went outside of my body, I went, I just kind of zoomed out the hospital walls there on the 5th floor, and I was kind of hovering outside the 5th floor of the hospital, and I saw this sneaker on the ledge out there. Looked like it'd been out there for 20 years. One of Dr. Melvin Morse's researchers at the University of Washington crawled out onto the ledge of that hospital, and there it was. How did he know? I'm asking you. This is tough to answer. I mean, oh, Mr. So-and-so, we lost your dentures. Oh, you really didn't. Actually, I saw the nurse when I was getting resuscitated. She yanked the dentures out of my mouth, and she threw it on this table, but it slid under a machine that looks just like this. So if you go down to the OR and you look at all those machines that look just like this, you'll find my dentures. There they are. Yeah, here you go, Mr. So-and-so. Here's your dentures back. When I was dead, I went into the waiting room next door, and my brother was there in my T-shirt insulting me. Never speak badly of the dead. The key thing, of course, is, and he knew the exact words of the insult. That's the best part. And of course, we're able to recount it. Dr. Janice Holden actually did then a comparative study of all of the veridical evidence of 37 major studies in peer-reviewed journals. Took all these things, she eliminated all the data that was not veridical, not unusual enough. So 55% of the data was too commonplace, the machine, the paddles, whatever. So the remaining 45%, get this, 37% of those people, 37% reported veridical, unusual data 100% accurately using the strictest criteria. Only 8% had slight inaccuracies, though generally correct in what they were describing. How do you explain that? Kids are kind of looking. Number 2, Kenneth Ring did a study of near-death experiences of the blind and discovered in his study that 80% of blind people regain their sight. And most of these people were blind from birth. So most of them, for the very first time in their lives, during their near-death experience. So they're floating out of their bodies, and for the first time in their lives, they're seeing down below, and they're going, I've never seen colors before. But the best part is, they not only can, for the first time, with great hardship, describe color and shape and try to describe it in terms of, because they've never had any words for it, right? They really didn't know what red was, but they could tell you it's a brighter color than this one over here. I could tell you it looked beautiful, so forth and so on. And of course, they describe these things, including veridical unusual data. 80%. How do you explain that? And then when they come back into their bodies, they're blind again. I got to tell you, it's hard to explain. Number 3, Dr. Melvin Morse over at the University of Washington Medical School did a huge study, had a kind of a modified polygraph machine to measure people's responses to death anxiety. And of course, he'd measure these little kids. So, he wanted patients without an agenda, and kids are great that way. And so, of course, he gets right out there. He's measuring this. Almost 100% of the kids who experienced clinical death, that's 25% of them, 25% of the total sample, right, had a near-death experience. Almost 100% of them actually had almost no death anxiety as measured by his modified polygraph. Of all the other 75%, almost 100% of them who did not have a near-death experience, their death anxiety was higher than the norm. How do you explain this? It's just really difficult unless there's some intervening experience that is so profound it affects the entire psyche. You can't fool the public. Well, maybe you can. Okay, but not all the time. 4th, you go over to the other side. And when you get over to the other side, you typically see either deceased relatives, or you see Jesus, or you see a loving white light, or all 3, or 2 out of 3. The key thing, of course, is when you get over to the other side, the little kids see Jesus, and even kids who are not Christians will come over, and they'll come back and they'll say, I saw Jesus. And the researcher will say, well, how did you know it was Jesus if you're not a Christian? Oh, he told me. Just that simple. Completely without agenda. But the more interesting thing is the relatives, the deceased relatives. So the kid goes over to the other side and meets Aunt, Iris, who the kid never heard of before. Comes back and says to his mom, hey, Mom, I met Aunt Iris. How'd you know Aunt Iris? She died 20 years before you were born. And then the kid says, oh, she told me it was her. And she says, well, how did you really know? Oh, she told me the secret name of your teddy bear, Cuddle Squared or whatever. That would have been my teddy bear. But the key thing, of course, is, the mother is in a state of shock because she never revealed this to anybody. It was the secret name, etc. What I'm trying to say is the evidence today for near-death experience is not only convincing to adults who really sit down and study it, not just convincing for the doctors, like Dr. Eben Alexander, who recently wrote that book, Proof of Heaven, and so forth, Harvard fellow, but it's very convincing to the kids.